What is the purpose of education? Now, I bet if I walked around and asked 10 different people, I'd probably hear some similar answers. Education is about strengthening the economy and getting a better job. Now I'd like you to take a moment and think about what purpose education has played in your life, specifically. And if I walked around and asked 10 of you that question, I might hear some different answers. And this is because education has many different purposes for us as individuals. The Milestone Institute invited me here to beautiful Budapest to talk about the future of education. And this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about and researching as a professor of education. For me, any discussion about the future of education has to grapple with questions about what the purpose of education is. And this is because the way we think about the purpose of education shapes how we plan for and envision the future for education. And throughout history, education has had many different purposes. In many places, originally, it was about protecting the position of elites and hoarding information and power. It has also been a place to train religious leaders and preserve and infuse religious values and encouraging people to adopt the prevailing faith practices of the day. It has been a place to prepare school teachers to teach children, and a place to share new knowledge and information and learn how to read, write, solve math problems, and conduct scientific experiments. Education has also been a place to gatekeep information and prevent those who are not in the elite from knowing more about the world. And as you'll notice, a thread through the history of the purposes of education is this tension between whether it's education's job to expand access and equity, or is it education's job to protect the power structures in society? In reality, education has many purposes. And there are at least 4 overarching purposes I can think of that we need to think about as we're planning for the future. First, education is definitely an important driver of the economy and a way for people to get a good job. In a world that is becoming increasingly expensive and an economy that's becoming increasingly global, there's an important role for education. Indeed, many of our lives were changed because we educated ourselves and got jobs that allowed us to have a living wage. Second, education is a powerful force for equity in society. Schools and colleges around the world expand access to people who historically would have been excluded. Education has been a place to foster equity in societies that are unequal and helped people become more financially secure and lifted entire families out of poverty. Of course, this isn't true at all times or in all places. We know that women, racial minorities, immigrants, and indigenous people are often systematically and intentionally excluded in dictatorships and even in some democracies. And this exclusion, for me, points to the transformative power of education. Dictators wouldn't fear women and marginalized people becoming educated if it didn't lead to enlightenment and empowerment that would cause these people to question the role of dictatorships. Third, education generates innovations that improve our quality of life. We heard about that in the last TED Talk. Important discoveries, including vaccines, effective economic models, educational interventions that help serve diverse students, language preservation, strategies for democracy and diplomacy, best practices for business, and information about the wicked challenges we face, including global climate change and mass extinctions, have all occurred in schools and universities. And it is in schools and universities that young people learn about these discoveries so they can make better choices about how to navigate the world. Education is a place to solve the wicked problems facing society. What is a wicked problem? C. West Churchman defined wicked problems as one that is difficult to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often hard to recognize. So you think of global climate change, migration, poverty, racism, fascism, and other wicked problems facing societies. Schools and colleges are laboratories for experimentation and learning to eventually solve these wicked problems. Finally, education is a force for transformation, possibility, and change. It is in the classroom that we learn valuable lessons about history, the problems we face, and the progress we've made as a species. We learn that we can grow and become different, and that new ways of living are possible. I love teaching because for my students, anything is possible and the world is malleable. When you get older, you lose some of that sense of what can be. Fostering that sense of transformation, possibility, and change is an important purpose of education. As a child, I experienced poverty that is all too common in the richest country in the world. I grew up on public assistance, and at times I was homeless. My family used home remedies often because we couldn't go to the doctor because we couldn't afford it. And I once broke my pinky while roller skating, and my parents fashioned a splint out of a popsicle stick and tape. And it mostly worked. To this day, I still can't totally straighten this pinky. But as a child, I dreamt of the day when I could go to the doctor and be able to pay for it, when I would never go hungry, when I would always have a place to live. I loved reading books because they transported me to places and futures that I could imagine as new possibilities for my life. The world was a wondrous place, and I wanted to learn everything I could and read every book I could get my hands on. And the truth is, I still do. I love school so much, I became a college professor, so I never had to leave. Education did exactly what I hoped it would. It changed my life. And this is true for many, but not all people. Each of you has your own ideas about education's purposes that are as unique to you as they are to me. And these purposes matter. So perhaps the question we should ask is, what are the purposes, plural, of education? And how might we plan for a future for education where all these purposes are protected and advanced, so other people can enjoy the kind of transformative experience I had and many of you had? How do we define education's purposes? Yes, with our heart, or our brain and our rationality, but also with our heart and our passion. This is a really big question, and it requires careful thought and planning. But too often, decisions about education are made because people are in crisis, trying to put out the fires that they see. Indeed, it is all too common to hear people say that education is in crisis. And this has been true throughout the history of education. So much so that we might imagine that ever since schools were created, they have been in crisis. And this causes people to panic. And the way people have defined crises facing education has a lot to do, again, with how they think about the purpose of education. At one point, people believed that education was in crisis because it was becoming too secular and the church was losing power over what children were learning. Later, people thought education was in crisis because it was too much, religion had too much influence over what students were learning. People have also believed education was in crisis because standards were too low and students were not learning enough. Still others believed that schools were too exclusionary and standards were too high, which kept students out. In a globalized world, many national leaders see education as in crisis when students score lower on tests because they fear that that puts their country's global competitiveness at risk. At times, people have worried that schools are indoctrinating students. You may have heard of this, but right now in the United States, there's a lot of debate over whether and how racism and race should be taught in schools, with some people believing it's really important to understand how racism shapes society, and others believing that racism is a myth or a relic of the past, no longer relevant. Policymakers will also often view how long students take to get through school and enter the workforce as a crisis, with these leaders claiming that the schools are wasteful and inefficient. When we are in crisis, something really interesting happens. This reptilian part of our brain, the part of our brain that tells us to fight, fly, or freeze, kicks in. And what that does is it takes over the other regions in our brain that we really need to make effective decisions. Now, it's okay if the reptilian brain kicks in if we're running from a bear or we're in mortal danger, but when we are making decisions about education, we really need these other parts of our brain, including the neocortex, where our rationality, our careful thought and consideration lives, and our limbic brain, where our passion, where our heart, our hopes and dreams for the future lives. What we really need is all these parts firing. We need the reptilian brain that encourages us to act decisively. We need the neocortex, which invites us to slow down and carefully consider the future. And we need that limbic brain, which connects us with our deeply held values and beliefs about education. But crisis planning makes it to where, again, that reptilian brain is really running the show. Crisis planning is also problematic because by their nature, crises are short-lived and they're episodic, yet the wicked problems we face in education have long been present and have escaped easy solutions or quick fixes. Consider the COVID-19 pandemic. This was a crisis that dramatically and rapidly changed the world. But now the pandemic is an epidemic, and we are returning to some version of the normality we had before. Look, we're all gathered together, no one's wearing masks, we're sharing space together as we did before the pandemic. However, what the COVID-19 crisis revealed was the continuing wicked problems we face as a world, including inequality, public health failures, natural disasters, and the difficulty of fostering cross-national collaboration to solve a crisis. And these remain challenges that, despite all the energy that went into fighting the pandemic, remain. In education, we have 4 major challenges that I can see, and there are many others that we can add to this list. But first is a narrowing of education's purpose. I started this talk by inviting you to consider the many different purposes that exist for education. And yet, policymakers and powerful people that make decisions about education often really narrowly focus on the role of schools in improving the economy and creating better jobs. And they ignore these other equally important purposes for education, like promoting equity, increasing public health, improving civil society, and strengthening democracy. Another challenge facing education and the world, really, is the ongoing threat of fascism, totalitarianism, and polarization, which is creeping into classrooms and societies. And this isn't new, right? We've been here before. As in other times in our history, we are living in a global age of a turn towards fascism and growing mistrust in social institutions like schools and government. Students around the world are having to learn in conflict zones where their safety and that of their families is threatened by the imperialist and dictatorial desires of world leaders. And that focused on the economic purpose of education weakens the ability of schools to guard against fascism by teaching students about the merits of democracy and civil society and helping them understand why fascism is a threat. Underfunding of schools is another huge challenge, and this is happening all around the world. And research shows that when we don't fund schools well enough, we have negative student outcomes, we underpay our teachers, and we create disparities in learning opportunities. So depending on where you go to school shapes the kind of quality of an experience that you have. And a final challenge, one that I spent a lot of time thinking about and researching, is the extreme inequality, both within countries and between countries, that people experience in education. Where people live, the amount of money they have, their citizenship status, and the color of their skin still shape the type of schools they have access to, if they have access to schools at all. And people are being displaced from their home countries and seeking opportunity elsewhere. And destination countries, as we see here with the exhibit on refugees in Hungary, are grappling with how and if to incorporate these people into their classrooms and into society. So you all might be thinking, okay, yeah, those are big challenges, but what about technology? Don't worry, I have an entire slide devoted to technology. And you know what's really interesting? People either view artificial intelligence, machine learning, other types of technology as a serious threat to education or a cure for all of the problems that we face. And technology has always influenced education. But now ChatGPT and artificial intelligence, as an earlier speaker discussed, raise questions about whether we need teachers or schools as currently construed. Did you know that when calculators were invented, people had the same concerns? Oh my gosh, no one will ever do math again. Scientific discoveries are going to end. But you know what happened? People used this new technology to make new discoveries. And people who maybe would have struggled with the more fundamental aspects of math were able to use the calculator, and they helped discover new things. I use statistics in my research a lot, and let me tell you, I'm not sitting down and running those data through the formula myself. I put them in a statistical application, put the data in, and it spits out the answer for me. I wouldn't have time to do that on my own. People also feared correspondence courses, which some of you may not know what that is, but in the 80s, this was a big thing where people would send out workbooks for classes. People would complete the workbooks at home and send it back and then get the grade. And people thought, oh my gosh, we're not going to need colleges and universities anymore with correspondence courses. Same with online courses. People thought, okay, this is going to end the need for universities and flesh and blood teachers. And yet, we still have universities and people gathering together to learn. And the current debate over AI reminds me of MOOCs. Does anyone know what a MOOC is? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4 people. MOOCs were supposed to change everything. In 2010s, they're massive online open courses, and you had universities like Harvard and Oxford offering them. And the idea was anyone could access them. They would enroll thousands and thousands of people, and this was going to end colleges as we knew it. And yet, I just asked an audience of 40 people, and only 4 people knew what they were. They didn't change much. Why is that? Because impersonal, large online lectures couldn't motivate people to finish. A lot of people would start the classes, but they didn't finish. And why is that? I think there's still some kind of magic that happens when we gather together like we are today to learn and to talk. The pandemic made hybrid learning experiences very common. So you learn online and in person. How many people have done a hybrid learning experience? Very common. And you know what the research shows? You actually learn more and more effectively. Students who experience online hybrid learning have higher test scores, they retain more information. And why is that, you think? Because when students are allowed to learn in a structured online format and then come together to process their learning, they learn more. And to me, this demonstrates how technology can be a tool to enhance learning, not replace it. When we view technology as a crisis or a magic wand, we are tempted to either try and block it entirely or rely on it too much, instead of building on what we already know about learning and finding ways to use technology to improve it. After college, I directed a national project that helped colleges register students to vote and participate in democratic society. And this is when Facebook and Twitter came out. That's how old I am. I'm older than Facebook and Twitter. Many of my older colleagues, though, and I was 23 at the time, they were convinced that social media was either going to save democracy or ruin it forever. And I remember thinking, and again, just 23 years old, but I think this is just a tool, and it will either help us or hurt us depending on how we use it. More recently, I had dinner with a 73-year-old friend of mine, and she teaches English to migrants. And she is panicked about ChatGPT because she's worried that students won't learn to read, write, or retain information. And I agree that these tools raise some concerns, but I told her I was concerned for different reasons. I don't think there's anything we can do to stop AI from coming into the classroom. In the US, we have this software program called Turnitin, and as a professor, I run my students' assignments through it to see if they've plagiarized. And you know what Turnitin found? 1 out of 10 assignments submitted online used ChatGPT to either write entirely or partly the assignment. And when did ChatGPT come out? 8 months ago. Imagine a year from now, how many assignments are going to be used in part or entirely written using ChatGPT. So I don't think there's really, again, anything we can do to stop that. The train has left the station. The students are on it. Our job as educators is to help students learn how to use these tools to enhance their education, not replace it. Ultimately, I believe schools are reflections of the best and worst of society. The technological innovations shaping society will always find their way into the classroom. And one of my favorite education philosophers, Michael Apple, often asks this very simple question in his work. Can schools save society? Can schools save society? This is a question that is vital for us to consider as we think about the future of education. And I don't see these crises as destroying anything. I think they're actually opportunities for us to rethink how we do teaching and learning. So I'd like us to consider a new revised question. What is education's responsibility to society and to our future? In our current era, the answer to this question is too often purely economic. It's about money. And there is danger in narrowly defining education's purpose by its economic role. Because when we do this, we lose out all those other purposes we talked about earlier on. Education clearly has an economic role, and I don't wish to argue otherwise. I am personally better off because of education, and for that, I am very grateful. Education creates jobs, it reduces income inequality, it strengthens the economy. But education also fosters creativity, unleashes innovation, creates transformation, fosters hope, and strengthens democratic society. When we narrowly focus on education's economic purpose, we change the way the system functions in society and in the lives of people. We prioritize efficiency over discovery, and we want to push students through education as quickly as possible so they can become human capital for industry. We diminish disciplines and fields of study that are not seen as having an economic payoff, including language, history, philosophy, the arts, history. We value education experiences that create creativity insofar as that creativity improves the economy. And we ignore types of education that generates creativity that helps us create beauty and hope. We fortify the barriers for entry to education, to schools, to protect the positions of the wealthy and the elite and the powerful. And we defund and stigmatize schools that provide access and equity. We reduce the public role in funding education because it's not a public good, it's a private good. It's a way for me to get richer. It's not a way to improve the society. And we view technology either as a cure-all or a crisis, instead of viewing it as a tool we can use to improve the world. So to answer Michael Apple's question, yes, I think education can save society. And it has a responsibility to our world and to our future, but only if we expand our understanding of education's purposes. As we look to the future of education, I believe we can make different choices. Education is a reflection of society, but it's also a place to imagine new possibilities for society. And there are 3 major ways I think we can do that to secure our future. Education should expand access and equity, teach students navigational skills, and foster connection. Education at its best, in my view, is a force for equity. It changes students' lives and creates opportunity by expanding access and equity. Yet too often, the very best schools are reserved for those with the most money and privilege And this is unacceptable. We live in a world of great wealth. Look around you. Schools should not be a place to hoard opportunity. It should be a place to share opportunity. We must break down the barriers to education so that everyone who wants to be educated has an opportunity, no matter what their skin color is, citizenship status, where they live, or how much money they have. An important first step in that process is to invest in schools so they can educate students. And I believe, and this is where Andor and I may differ, but we should also change policies that are intended to keep students out and instead invite them in. But we need to support them. So if they're not quite prepared yet, we help them get ready. That's what education is for. We teach. We help expand people's abilities. And I'm here speaking to you today because I had access to schools that maybe historically would have kept me out because I didn't have the money to pay for them. It is not only important to reduce barriers to education, it's also important to think about what students learn in the classroom. We must focus less, and this may be controversial, but we must focus less on teaching students in-demand skills for the economy right now, because technology is changing literally everything. And the jobs that exist today may not exist in 10 years or even 5 years. History has shown us that the jobs that our young people who are in school right now are going to work in 10 years, we can't even imagine them. So to prepare students for this future, we must teach them how to navigate the world and how rapidly changing it is, to understand that and to develop a schema for it. And these navigational skills include the ability to solve problems, to think critically, and to work and play with people who are different than them. We also need to design educational experiences that cultivate people's inner creativity and curiosity. We may not always need engineers and computer scientists and lawyers and doctors as they're currently being trained right now. But you know what we'll always need? People who are creative and want to improve the world. We must also help people learn how to use technology effectively, but also how to unplug and be present and center their humanity and that of the people in their lives, to navigate the world in human-centered and creative ways. For those students who want to work in technology, how many people are going into technology or work in technology currently? So for you, our job is to help those students develop a moral compass, to question the role of technology in society, and understand that it's not neutral. In fact, it's very political, it's very powerful, to take ownership of their role in shaping these tools, but also consider how the tools might be misused, and to take responsibility for fixing the tools when they are used for harm. And then finally, schools must help students foster connections with other people, but also between ideas and information. Ironically, social media, when it was created, it was intended to strengthen relationships. But research shows it actually weakens relationships and social ties. People who use technology to connect with other people often have shallower connections. I guess it turns out that liking a reel on Instagram doesn't hit the same way as a hug or sharing a meal together or gathering in person like this and being together. Schools should also be a place for fostering connections between ideas and information, for making connections between what has happened in the past, what is happening right now, so we can plan for the future. For understanding how the seemingly distinct challenges that seem to have nothing to do with each other are actually very connected and need multi-pronged approaches to finding solutions. How big ideas found in science and art and math and yes, technology all connect and help us create a better world. I want to close by sharing a picture. Does anyone know what this is? Any English folks in the audience? This is the House of Commons in Great Britain, and this is their parliamentary chamber. And the designers of this chamber believe that, quote, it should be oblong and not semicircular. There should not be room for all of its members. Like they're practically sitting on each other's laps. It should be designed to preserve that intimacy of debate and discussion, freedom, and sense of urgency. Did you know that fist fights often break out on the floor of the chamber because people are like so crammed in? And when I look at this picture, I also think about who has access to this place. They all look fairly similar in their racial identities, and I don't see a single person navigating the world in a wheelchair. I also think about if you were that person right there and you had to go to the bathroom, what would you do? This, for me, is a metaphor for the future of education. We shape our institutions, and then they shape us in the future. That is why it's so critically important that we be careful and intentional about who we talk about and plan for the future of education and think about the system's purposes. Yes, schools are a place to gain skills for the workforce, but they are also a place to expand access and equity, to teach navigational skills, and to foster connections. And we must work diligently to preserve these opportunities and experiences in education. Despite the challenges facing education, again, remember, I still think schools can save society. I believe bell hooks, another one of my favorite philosophers, when she wrote, "The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility." In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education as the practice of freedom. Education exists between two worlds, the world as it is right now and the world as it should be. The world that bell hooks imagined and the world that we live in. And I believe that as we expand access and equity, as we teach navigational skills, and as we foster connections, we can get a little closer to the world as it should be. We all have the power to shape education so that people can learn and grow in schools that foster their potential and nurture their dreams. This is education as the practice of freedom. Thank you.